The most dangerous conversations in the world happen in the quietest rooms. In the private dining suite on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Grand Hotel in Las Vegas, men with 9-figure fortunes discussed things that would make federal prosecutors weep into their briefcases, and every single one of them spoke freely, openly, without a single flicker of concern, because the woman refilling their water glasses was, as far as they were concerned, furniture. Bridget Mallory had learned that truth during her first week at the Meridian 3 years ago. She was 29 years old, 5'4", and built like her grandmother described herself. Solid, with soft brown hair she kept pinned back so tight it gave her headaches, and a face that people called sweet when they were being polite and plain when they weren't. She wore the hotel's standard-issue black uniform, which fit her the way a tablecloth fit a dining room chair, technically covering everything, suggesting nothing. The hotel had once offered her a position at the front desk, but the manager had walked her past the lobby mirror and said, with a practiced smile, that perhaps she was better suited to behind-the-scenes work. Bridget hadn't argued. She'd learned, somewhere around age 12, that arguing required visibility, and she had none. What she did have was a memory like a legal transcript and eyes that missed nothing. The private suite was reserved exclusively for guests the hotel's general manager personally approved, the kind of guests who paid for rooms in cash, requested that housekeeping be suspended during their stay, and whose names never appeared in the booking system under their real identities. Bridget had been assigned to the suite for 18 months. She knew every regular. She knew which men preferred bourbon and which preferred scotch, who was cheating on their wife, who was hiding money offshore, and which 2 men were the same person who'd shown up under different aliases 6 months apart. She said nothing. She poured water. She was furniture. On a sweltering Thursday evening in mid-July, the suite had been booked under the name Harrington Consulting Group. Every member of the floor staff knew that name was a shell, a polished empty vessel that existed only to reserve the largest private room in the building. Bridget straightened her apron, tucked a fresh cocktail napkin under her arm, and pushed through the service entrance with a silver tray. The man at the head of the table was Cale Stanton. She recognized him the moment she walked in. Even though she'd never seen his face before, she recognized him the way you recognized a storm front, not by looking directly at it, but by the way everything around it changed. The other 7 men in the room sat slightly straighter when he leaned back. They paused their conversations to track his attention. They smiled a half-second after he smiled, and stopped a half-second after he stopped. Cale Stanton was 41 years old, though he looked older in some lights and younger in others, depending on whether the tension was sitting behind his eyes or not. He was built like someone who had worked with his hands before the money arrived. Broad through the chest and shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been deliberately carved with too much precision. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Bridget made in 3 months, and he wore it with the particular ease of a man who had stopped noticing money entirely. He was, depending on who you asked, either the CEO of Stanton Capital and Infrastructure or the most strategically invisible power broker on the western seaboard. The FBI had a file on him. So did 2 competing organized crime families. Neither had been able to make anything stick. Cale Stanton was the kind of man who built his empire by never being the person who pulled the trigger. He was the person who decided, months in advance, whether a trigger needed to exist at all. Bridget moved along the perimeter, refilling glasses, lifting empty dishes, becoming part of the wallpaper with practiced ease. The conversation at the table was about a port contract, specifically a freight and customs operation out of Long Beach that 3 different entities wanted and only one would get. Bridget caught the words inspection window, federal liaison, union agreement, and termination clause in her first pass around the table. By the time she'd completed her second loop with a fresh decanter of water, she had the full shape of the deal in her head. But it wasn't the deal that made her stop cold, internally, while her hands kept moving. It was the man seated 2 chairs to Cale Stanton's left. His name was Douglas Avery. Bridget knew him because he'd been in the suite 4 months ago, representing a separate party in an unrelated negotiation, a real estate firm that was. She'd later understood from overheard fragments, essentially a money-cleaning operation. He'd been on Stanton's side of the table that night. A trusted affiliate. Tonight, Douglas Avery was doing something small and almost imperceptible. Every time Cale Stanton spoke, Avery's right hand moved beneath the table's edge. Not fidgeting, not reaching for his phone. A deliberate, rhythmic motion, his finger tapping once against his thigh, once per sentence. Like he was counting, like he was logging. Bridget set the water pitcher down at the service station. She stood with her back to the room, watching the mirrored panel on the far wall. The Meridian's private suite had been designed with a full mirrored accent wall on the west side. The interior designer's gesture toward opulence. What it actually created was an unobstructed reverse view of the entire room for anyone standing at the service station. Bridget watched Avery's reflection for the length of 1 full minute. There was a small, almost invisible earpiece tucked into his right ear. She could see it only because the angle of the mirror gave her a view of his profile that the other men didn't have. The earpiece was flesh-toned and custom-fitted, not a consumer device. The kind of thing law enforcement contractors used, or the kind of thing a man used when someone on the other end of a signal needed to know exactly what was being said. She looked at the exits. The suite had 2. The main door, which opened to the private elevator lobby, and the service entrance she'd come through. There were 3 other hotel staff in the room. A junior sommelier named Thomas, a second server named Kim, and a floor manager named Edward, who mostly stood near the door looking supervisory. None of them were watching Avery. They were all doing what trained hospitality staff did, looking at the guests without seeing them. Bridget wiped down the service counter. Her hands were steady. Her mind was not. She turned the problem over quickly, the way she always processed things that mattered. Not in a panic, but in the cold, rapid-fire sequence she'd developed from years of watching powerful people make fast decisions in contained spaces. If Avery was recording, he was either law enforcement or he was working for a competing interest. If he was law enforcement, everyone in this room was potentially about to be arrested, and Bridget was a civilian bystander who would get swept up in the chaos regardless. If he was working for someone else, then Cale Stanton was being set up, either for blackmail or for something worse, depending on what the competing interest wanted. Either way, in the next 20 minutes, this room was going to become a very dangerous place to be. Bridget looked at Cale Stanton. He was listening to one of his associates lay out a contract timeline, and he was doing it with the focused patience of a man who had sat through 10,000 meetings. He had a glass of bourbon at his right hand. He hadn't touched it in 40 minutes. She'd been tracking the level. He was sharp, fully present, and completely unaware that the man 2 seats to his left was feeding every word of this conversation to an unknown party outside this room. She made a decision. It wasn't heroic. She didn't think of it that way. She thought of it the way she thought of most decisions that scared her. This is the correct thing to do, and I am going to do it before I can talk myself out of it. She pulled a small notepad from her apron pocket, the kind every server used for orders. She tore a single leaf from the bottom, careful to keep the motion small and close to her body. She wrote in block print, compact and clear, Avery. Left ear, recording device. 2 seats to your left, not law. Earpiece is contractor grade. Check his right hand. She folded the paper twice. She palmed it. Then she picked up the bourbon decanter, crossed the room at her usual pace, and approached Cale Stanton's right side. Refill, sir. He glanced up. No. Thank you. The same two words he used every time, always the thank you. She'd noticed that in his first visit. Most of the men in these rooms didn't bother. She reached forward to adjust the cocktail napkin beneath his glass. A standard, invisible gesture of service maintenance that no one in the room would clock as anything other than what it appeared to be. As she did, she set the folded note flush against the base of his glass and pressed it gently into the space between the crystal and the napkin. Then she straightened, turned, and walked back to the service station. Behind her, the conversation continued without a pause. She watched the mirror. Cale Stanton did not react. He didn't flinch, didn't look at her retreating back, didn't immediately reach for the note. He waited through 90 full seconds of his associate's presentation. Then, during a natural pause in the conversation when two other men began a side exchange, he lifted his bourbon glass, took a single unhurried sip, and set it down. When his hand came back up to the table, it was empty. The paper was gone. Bridget counted her own heartbeats. She got to 11 before she saw it. The microscopic shift in Cale Stanton's posture. Not alarm, not surprise. The particular recalibration of a man who had just received information and was now quietly reordering everything around it. His chin dropped a fraction of an inch. His eyes moved once to Douglas Avery, and then away. Fast enough that if you hadn't been watching for exactly that movement, you would have missed it completely. He didn't look at Bridget. He reached into his jacket and removed his phone, and typed something with his thumb. Put it away. Picked up his bourbon, set it down again. 40 seconds later, the door to the suite opened and two men walked in whom Bridget had never seen before. They moved to positions flanking the door, not aggressively, not with visible weapons, but with the quiet efficiency of people who had been told precisely where to stand and why. Cale Stanton looked at Douglas Avery. "Douglas," he said. His voice was even and completely absent of heat. "I've been meaning to ask, how's the Callaway deal closing?" Avery looked up. His smile was practiced. "Should finalize by end of month. The East Coast guys are dragging their feet, but nothing we can't." "I'm not asking about the timeline," Cale said mildly. "I'm asking who you're reporting the timeline to." The room went still. Avery's expression held for approximately 3 seconds before it broke along the edges, a tightening around the eyes, a barely visible swallow. "I don't know what. Right ear," Cale said. "Or left, actually. You're right-handed, so left ear is unusual, but you compensated well. I almost didn't notice." Avery's hand moved toward his jacket. The two men by the door moved faster. What followed was brief, professional, and largely silent, the kind of controlled situation management that left the crystal undisturbed on the table and the other 6 associates, with the good sense, to very deliberately look at nothing. Avery was escorted from the room. One of Cale's men stayed behind, standing along the wall like a statue. Cale addressed the remaining associates with the measured calm of a man rescheduling a meeting. "We'll reconvene the contract discussion in 48 hours at a different location. I'll have Leon send coordinates." He closed the leather folder in front of him. "Enjoy your evenings." The men filed out. The suite emptied in under 4 minutes. Bridget began clearing the table. She was stacking cocktail glasses when the door clicked shut behind the last associate, and she realized she was alone in the room with Cale Stanton and the man who had remained behind. Cale didn't move from his chair immediately. He sat in the specific stillness of someone who was thinking rather than resting, his elbow on the armrest, one knuckle pressed against his lower lip. Then he said, without turning his head, "You wrote it in block print so I couldn't trace your handwriting." Bridget set down the glass she was holding. "I wrote it in block print so it would be fast to read." He turned then. He looked at her, the Wargent, and he looked at balance sheets, comprehensively, without sentiment, searching for the figure that mattered. "How long have you been assigned to this suite?" he asked. 18 months, and before tonight, you've heard things in this room." It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "Yes, and you've never said anything to anyone." It wasn't my business. He tilted his head slightly, but tonight was. Bridget looked at the mirrored wall, then back at him. Tonight you were going to walk out of here not knowing your own table was compromised. I don't know who Avery was feeding, but someone with contractor-grade equipment wanted a recording of this conversation. That's not a small problem. It was going to get worse before you figured it out on your own. Silence. How did you know the earpiece wasn't law enforcement? She almost smiled, but kept it contained. Law enforcement doesn't use that particular custom fit. Too expensive for department budgets. Wrong frequency profile. The housing is commercial contractor spec, the kind you find in corporate intelligence firms. Also, Federal doesn't send one man into a room like this. They send teams and they wire the whole building. He was alone. Cale Stanton looked at her for a long moment. What's your name? Bridget Mallory. He said it once, quietly, as if filing it somewhere. How do you know what Federal surveillance equipment looks like, Bridget? I read, she said simply. A lot. About a lot of things. Another silence. This one was different from the last. The first had been assessment. This one felt more like the pause before a question that actually mattered. Why did you tell me? He asked. You could have walked out of this room and let it be someone else's problem. Bridget thought about it for a moment. The real answer wasn't complicated, but it was the kind of answer that sounded strange when you said it out loud to someone who lived in a world where most people operated from clean self-interest. She said it anyway. You've been in this suite 9 times in the last 18 months. You've never sent a dish back. You've never snapped your fingers at anyone. Last November, when Tomas dropped an entire tray of glassware during your contract closing dinner, you were the only person at the table who asked if he was okay before anyone talked about the mess. She met his eyes steadily. People like that are worth a 30-second detour. The silence after that one sat differently than the others. Cale Stanton stood up slowly. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his jacket, removed a card and placed it on the cleared section of tablecloth beside her tray. It was matte black, with a single phone number embossed in silver. No name, no company. Someone is going to call you tomorrow morning, he said. His name is Harmon. Tell him I said Amber. What does Amber mean? It means you're under my protection. He said it with the same inflection he might have used to explain a contract clause, direct, factual, without drama. Avery knew someone handed him off tonight. He won't know who, but his people might look for the variable. You're the variable. He paused. Don't be alone for the next 72 hours. Then he picked up his folder, said goodnight to the man by the wall, and left. Bridget stood in the silent suite for a moment, looking at the black card. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Las Vegas spread below like a circuit board lit from within, all grid and light and controlled electricity. She picked up the card, slid it into her apron pocket, and went back to clearing the table. Her hands, she noticed, had finally stopped being steady. That was the moment she understood she was afraid. She'd been too focused to be afraid during the actual event. The fear arrived now, in the quiet, the way it always did. Late and all at once, filling up the space left by the adrenaline. She was afraid. She had also, very probably, just saved a man who moved entire cities without anyone seeing his fingerprints on them. She wasn't entirely sure those two things were going to be easy to live with simultaneously. The call from Harmon came at 7:43 the next morning, before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. He was businesslike, efficient, and spoke in the compressed shorthand of someone accustomed to saying precise things in few words. He arranged a car, and the car took her not to a meeting room or an office building, but to a private estate 40 minutes outside the city, tucked into the Red Rock foothills, where the desert turned quiet, and the light came down clear and hard. The house was modern and enormous, and had the particular atmosphere of a place that was kept perfectly ordered because disorder wasn't tolerated, not because anyone lived there comfortably. Bridget was led into a study lined with architectural drawings and shipping manifests, which told her more about Cale Stanton's actual priorities than any press release had ever managed. He was already there when she arrived, jacket gone, shirt sleeves folded back, standing over a drafting table with a pair of reading glasses she suspected he was privately embarrassed about. He offered her coffee. She accepted. They talked for 3 hours, not about the previous night, specifically. That territory was covered quickly, efficiently, and then set aside. They talked about what she'd seen in the suite over 18 months. Not the specifics of deals, which she was careful about, but patterns. Who was reliable and who wasn't? Who brought tension into the room with them? Whose body language during a handshake was different from their body language during a closing? She talked about it the way she always thought about it. Clinically, precisely, like someone who'd been cataloging data for years with no particular audience in mind, and was only now being asked to present findings. He listened to her the way she imagined he read contracts, completely, without interruption, noting things she couldn't see him noting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have 23 people on my security team. I have a forensic accountant, 3 attorneys on retainer, and an intelligence analyst I brought in from a former federal position. Not one of them told me about Avery." "They weren't in the room," Bridget said. "No," he paused. "But you were." She looked at the drafting table. The architectural drawings were for a freight terminal. The Long Beach port, she realized, the same contract that had been on the table last night. "I'm a hotel server, Mr. Stanton." "You have a degree in organizational psychology that you've never used," he said. It wasn't an accusation. "You've been working in high-end private hospitality for 7 years. You can read a room full of powerful men the way most people read a weather forecast, accurately and in advance." Utter. He took off the reading glasses he was trying not to be embarrassed about and set them on the table. "I'm not interested in what your job title says you are. I'm interested in what you actually do." The offer he made her was not what she expected. She'd been braced for something transactional, a payment for the previous night, a non-disclosure agreement, a polite dismissal dressed as a thank you. What he offered instead was a position. Officially, Senior Operational Analyst for Stanton Capital and Infrastructure. Unofficially, the person who sat in the corner of every meeting Cale Stanton attended and told him afterward what the room had actually said versus what the words had. The salary he named made her set down her coffee cup. "I don't carry a weapon," she said. "I don't want to. I'm not asking you to. And I won't falsify documents or help with anything that puts me in front of a federal grand jury. Those aren't things I need from you." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without performing patience, which was the thing she noticed about him again. He didn't perform. He simply was what he was, which was terrifying, and, somehow, oddly restful. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "The truth," he said, "about what's happening in any room we're in, while it's happening, not after." She picked up her coffee cup again. She thought about the Meridian, about the service entrance and the mirror, and the way she'd watched that room for a year and a half, with no one ever thinking to ask her what she saw. She thought about what it meant to have eyes like hers, and a life that had been carefully constructed to make those eyes useful to no one, including herself. "All right," she said. "When do I start?" What followed over the next 5 months was the most disorienting and quietly extraordinary period of Bridget Mallory's life. She moved through Cale Stanton's world, like a current running beneath the surface, present at every significant meeting, seated in corners or standing at the periphery, dressed now in tailored clothing that had been selected with the specific intention of making her look like she belonged in rooms she'd previously only served. The wardrobe change was Cale's doing, accomplished through 2 sentences. "You need to be present, not invisible. Call this number, and then a stylist who treated Bridget's curves like a structural feature rather than a problem to be solved. The first real test came in September, during a negotiation with a freight broker named Aldrich Bauer, who was brokering terms on behalf of a port coalition. Bridget sat in the corner of a conference room on the 28th floor of a downtown high-rise and watched Bauer for 40 minutes. After the meeting, she told Cale that Bauer's verbal commitments were genuine, but his principle. Whoever had sent him was going to pull authorization at the last moment because Bauer kept touching his left wrist, where a watch would be. But he'd removed the watch, which meant he'd been coached to not have anything distracting on his person, which meant someone had briefed him extensively before the meeting, which meant Bauer was more of a messenger than a decision-maker, and the decision-maker had already made a different decision. Cale held the contract for 3 extra days. On the 4th day, Bauer's principal withdrew. 2 competing firms had already been given a counteroffer. Cale told her afterward, very briefly, "You saved us $250,000 in sunk costs," she said. "You should think about getting your watch back. The absence is distracting." He blinked at her. Then, for the first time in her presence, he laughed. A real one, brief and a little surprised, like it had escaped before he could decide whether to allow it. She liked the sound of it more than was professionally useful. She didn't examine that too closely initially. There were other things to focus on. A December audit of 3 subsidiary firms that required her to sit through 11 hours of financial review meetings and identify, correctly, that the lead auditor had a pre-existing relationship with one of the subsidiaries that he'd failed to disclose. There was a January sit-down with a West Coast union representative that she flagged as a setup. The representative had been photographed 2 weeks prior with a known affiliate of a competing interest, and Cale had the meeting rescheduled and restructured in a way that removed the vulnerability she'd identified. Every time she was right, she felt something shift slightly in the way people in Cale's organization looked at her. Not warmly, necessarily. More like the way a room recalibrates when it realizes the furniture is load-bearing. She stopped apologizing for the space she took up. She wasn't sure when exactly that happened. It wasn't a single moment so much as a gradual accumulation of days during which no one looked through her, because Cale Stanton never looked through her, and in his orbit, that set the standard for everyone else. She started wearing colors. She stopped keeping her hair so punishingly tight. She bought shoes that were comfortable and looked like she'd chosen them rather than defaulted to them. She was still herself. She was just herself, without the apologetic packaging. In February, during a late evening review of shipping contracts, Cale said her name in the middle of a sentence about freight manifests, and then stopped. She looked up from the document in front of her. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the assessment look she knew, and not the focused listening look she'd catalogued, but something unguarded and slightly unresolved. "I was going to ask about the Long Beach filing," he said. "I know," she said. "You stopped. I was thinking about something else." "I noticed." A pause. "Does it bother you?" he said. "When I look at you like this?" Bridget set her pen down. Her pulse had made a decision independent of the rest of her, apparently. "How are you looking at me?" "Like I've been trying not to for 3 months and I've run out of reasons to keep trying." The direct honesty of it landed like a hand on the table, solid, unambiguous, no room for the kind of misinterpretation she might have used as an exit. She was quiet for a moment, because she'd learned that the quality of a silence could tell you more than any immediate response. "You could have said something 3 months ago," she said finally. "You were new," he said. "And I didn't want you to stay because of what I said. I wanted you to stay because of the work." She understood that. She understood it deeply, actually, because she'd spent the better part of her adult life doing things in the service of people who looked past her, and the idea of being valued for what she did before being valued for anything else was, she realized the thing she'd been quietly hungry for so long she'd forgotten she was hungry. "I'm staying because of the work," she said. "That's not going to change." "I know," he said. He said it the way he said most things that mattered to him, without ornamentation, without performance. "I wasn't asking you to choose. I was telling you where I am." She looked at him across the contracts and the empty coffee cups and the quiet room that smelled of paper, and the good bourbon he kept on the sideboard, but rarely touched. "Then I'll tell you where I am," she said. "I've been watching you for 5 months. I'm good at reading rooms. I know when someone means what they say." He waited. "You mean it," she said. The first time she attended a major industry event in her official capacity, it was the annual Western Infrastructure Summit, a gathering of every significant player in freight, development, and capital investment on the West Coast. It was held in March, at a private venue in San Francisco that had been rented entirely for the occasion, and it was the kind of event where attendees wore the names of their industries like armor. When Cale Stanton walked in, he walked in with Bridget beside him, and he did not position her as staff or affiliate or background. He introduced her to the first 3 people, who approached them by her full name and her title, his hand at the small of her back, in a posture that was so quietly declarative it required no announcement. She was wearing a deep plum dress that had been made specifically for her, structured through the shoulders and chest, draped through the hips, designed by a woman who understood that curves were architecture, and architecture deserved a plan. Her hair was loose and deliberately styled. She felt, for possibly the first time in her professional memory, like someone who had arrived rather than appeared. A man she recognized from several overheard conversations, a Port Coalition director named Everett March, approached with the particular expression of someone who was recalibrating a previous assumption in real time. "Stanton," he said. "And this must be Bridget Mallory," Cale said. "She's the reason I knew about the Avery situation before it became a liability. She's also the reason the Bauer negotiation didn't cost us the Q4 position." A pause perfectly weighted. "She sees things, Everett. All the things you and I miss because we're the ones doing the talking." Everett March shook her hand. He did it with both of his. Later, standing at the edge of the room while Cale was in a side conversation, Bridget looked out at the assembled weight of the industry and felt the particular quiet vertigo of someone who has spent years becoming invisible on purpose and is now, for the first time, trying out what it feels like to be entirely seen. It didn't feel the way she'd expected. It felt, surprisingly, like standing on solid ground. 2 weeks later, at a smaller dinner in Los Angeles, Cale introduced her to 3 of his most senior associates. He said, simply before the introductions began, "She's the most accurate person in any room she's in, and she is not someone whose read on a situation you want to discount, because she has not been wrong." One of the associates, a weathered man named Breckett who'd been in this world for 30 years, looked at Bridget with the slow, measuring gaze of someone who didn't extend respect easily. "What did you see tonight?" he asked her, testing. She thought for 2 seconds. "The man who came in with the Hara logistics delegation is not who he says he is. He recognized your security lead by sight when they passed in the lobby. He covered it, but not fast enough, and he's been angling to sit nearest the window all evening, which is either habit or he wants a sight line to the exit." Breckett looked at Cale. Cale said nothing. He just waited. Breckett turned back to Bridget. "How long have you been doing this?" "About 30 years, she said. "I just didn't know I was doing it until someone asked." Breckett was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once, in the slow way of a man who'd revised a position and wasn't embarrassed about it. The woman who had spent 3 years refilling water glasses in a private hotel suite so that powerful men could speak freely around her was not in that room anymore. In her place stood someone those same men were now careful to speak to.